The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
What Love Is This? By Dave Hunt. Chapter 1. Why this book? Can you answer some questions about Calvinism? The query came to me from a young man sitting with me and several others at a restaurant in a city where I was speaking at a conference. Why do you ask me? We heard you were writing a book about Calvinism. Yes, I am. A book, in fact, that I didn't want to write. There are fine Christians on both sides. The last thing I want to do is create more controversy. But it's a topic that really has to be faced and dealt with thoroughly. Glancing around the table, I was surprised at the sudden interest reflected on each face. Everyone was listening intently. The young man went on. I had scarcely given Calvinism a thought for years. Then suddenly, or so it seemed to me, in the last few years, Calvinism has emerged as an issue everywhere. Perhaps I'm just waking up, but it seems to me that this peculiar doctrine is being promoted far more widely and aggressively now than I was ever aware of in the past. Our church recently added a new associate pastor to the staff, a graduate of the Master's College and Seminary in Southern California, explained the young man. He introduces Calvinism in almost every session in his Bible class. Let me suggest how he might do it, I responded. He asks the class what they think comes first, faith or regeneration. Everyone says, faith, of course. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved. Then he challenges them, but mankind is dead in trespasses and sins. How can a dead man believe? I had the young man's total attention. That's it exactly. How did you know? Then he explains, I continued, that God has to give life sovereignly to those who are spiritually dead before they can believe or even understand the gospel, that regeneration must precede faith. You're right, but it seems bizarre, like having to get saved before you can get saved, said the young man. The Calvinist wouldn't put it in those precise words, I responded, but it's even a bit stranger than that. Without understanding or believing anything about God or Christ or the Bible, because the totally depraved supposedly can't until they're regenerated, the elect are made spiritually alive by a sovereign act of God, without any desire or cooperation on their part, and without even knowing what is happening to them at the time. That's exactly what he's been teaching, added another member of the same church. It doesn't make sense. I never read anything like that in the Bible. Are you the only ones who have expressed any concern? I asked. Do those who thought that faith came first accept this new concept immediately? Most do, but it has caused some confusion, and a few people have left the church. No one challenges him, I asked, with the obvious fact that spiritual death can't be equated with physical death. That physically dead people not only can't believe, but can't sin or do anything else. I guess none of us have thought of that. What does the senior pastor say? He doesn't seem to know how to handle the confusion. We never heard anything like this from the pulpit before, but now hints of Calvinism are even finding their way into his sermons. The conversation went on like this for some time. Every new aspect of Calvinism, I explained, was greeted with further exclamations of, "Yes, that's exactly what we're hearing." Others, from entirely different areas of the country, began to relate their experiences. One man had recently left a church that had split over Calvinism. The deacon board had voted that every member must sign a Calvinistic statement of faith. Someone else came from a church whose pastor and elders had taken a hard line against what they considered a divisive issue and had disfellowshipped a Sunday school teacher for influencing his junior high class with Calvinism in spite of several warnings. Another couple had visited a highly recommended church in a large city near their home, pastored by a well-known Calvinist author. "We don't really know much about Calvinism," my dinner companions confessed, "but it was a strange experience. On the one hand, we had the impression that these people felt certain they were the elect, yet there also seemed to be some insecurity, as though performance were a major evidence of one's salvation." As we got up to leave, a young woman who had sat through the entire discussion in silence asked if she could have a private moment of my time. We sat down again, and she began a tale of grief. She was a pastor's wife. Their lives in ministry had been happy and fruitful until her husband and two close friends, also pastors, became interested in a new truth. All three were very intellectual. As a result of reading current Calvinist authors, they had been drawn into the writings of John Calvin, Jonathan Edwards, John Knox, and others. Their study, taking them all the way back to Augustine, eventually became almost an obsession. Then each of them began to preach their new light from the pulpits. After being warned several times to desist, they were removed from their pastorates. Eventually, her husband began to worry whether he was really one of the elect. The nagging questions grew into full-blown doubts about his salvation. The Calvinism that had once seemed so satisfying began to haunt him with uncertainty. Was he one of the elect? "You were never drawn into it?" I asked her. She shook her head. "I'm not an intellectual, which may be why it never appealed to me. But isn't God supposed to be a God of love? In my simple mind, it didn't make any sense that the God of the Bible didn't love everyone enough to want them all in heaven, that Christ hadn't died for everyone, even though the Bible seemed to say that he had." Tears came to her eyes. At last she continued, "I kept trying to tell my husband that the God he was now believing in, a God who predestined people before they were even born to spend eternity in the lake of fire, was not the God I knew and loved." Troubling encounters such as these became more frequent and soon demanded deeper insight on my part into a system obviously embraced by a larger portion of the church than I had realized. It seemed so alien to everything I had believed about a God whose sovereignty did not diminish his mercy and love. For my own peace of mind, I was compelled to pursue the lengthy investigation that resulted in this book, an issue of great importance. Calvinism has never seemed biblical to me for a number of reasons that we will come to in due order. Over the years, my considerable objections have been discussed privately in detail with several friends who are staunch Calvinists. Thankfully, in spite of our serious differences and our inability to resolve them, there was never any loss of goodwill. We remain in close friendship to this day and simply avoid this subject. It is true that throughout history, many of the great evangelists, missionaries, and stalwart theologians held to the doctrines of grace known as Calvinism. R.C. Sproul declares that the titans of classical Christian scholarship are Calvinists. The additional claim is often made that although many have not made it known publicly, most of today's leading evangelicals in America hold to some form of this doctrine. I soon discovered that there were far more books in print promoting Calvinism than I had ever imagined. Their number and influence are growing rapidly. The New Geneva Study Bible aggressively promotes Calvinism in its marginal explanations of key passages. It claims to represent Reformation truth. That bold phrase equates the Reformation with Calvinism, a proposition that is almost universally accepted among evangelicals today. The question of whether this is true, which we will deal with in the following pages, is surely one of great importance. The significance of our concern is given further weight by the fact that its proponents even claim that Calvinism is pure biblical Christianity in its clearest and purest expression. Dr. James Kennedy has said, I am a Presbyterian because I believe Presbyterianism is the purest form of Calvinism. John Piper writes, "The doctrines of grace, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints, are the warp and woof of the biblical gospel cherished by so many saints for centuries." Wouldn't this mean, then, that those who do not preach Calvinism do not preach the gospel? And how could evangelicals possibly be saved who reject the 5 points of Calvinism that Piper claims are the warp and woof of the biblical gospel? C.H. Spurgeon, who at times contradicted Calvinism, declared, "Those great truths which are called Calvinism are, I believe, the essential doctrines of the gospel that is in Jesus Christ." Now, I do not ask whether you believe all this, that is Calvinism. It is possible you may not, but I believe you will before you enter heaven. I am persuaded that as God may have washed your hearts, he will wash your brains before you enter heaven. Such a strong statement is impressive, coming from Charles Haddon Spurgeon. John H. Gerstner writes, "We believe with the great Baptist preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon that Calvinism is just another name for Christianity." Again, if Calvinism is true Christianity, would that mean that non-Calvinists are not Christians? Surely most Calvinists would not say so, but isn't that the implication? Of course, there were many Christian leaders of equal stature in the history of the Church, such as D.L. Moody, who were of the opposite opinion. Norman F. Doty lists more than 70 Christian leaders who, in whole or in part, opposed Calvinism, especially its doctrine of limited atonement. Among them such men as Richard Baxter, John Newton, John and Charles Wesley, John Bunyan, H.C.G. Moule, and others. A study of early church history reveals that Calvinistic doctrines were unknown during the Church's first 3 centuries. From his knowledge of ecclesiastical history, Bishop Davenant declares, "It may be truly affirmed that before the dispute between Augustine and Pelagius, there was no question concerning the death of Christ, whether it was to be extended to all mankind, or to be confined only to the elect. For the Fathers, not a word that I know of occurs among them of the exclusion of any person by the decree of God. They agree that it is actually beneficial to those only who believe, yet they everywhere confess that Christ died in behalf of all mankind." Augustine died in A.D. 429, and up to his time, at least, there is not the slightest evidence that any Christian ever dreamed of a propitiation for the elect alone. Even after him, the doctrine of a limited propitiation was but slowly propagated, and for long but partially received. Today, there is a growing division on this issue, most Calvinists insisting that Christ died only for the elect. On the other hand, IFCA International, a group of about 700 independent evangelical churches and 1,200 pastors, some of them Calvinists, declares in its doctrinal statement, "We believe that the Lord Jesus Christ died on the cross for all mankind, to accomplish the redemption of all who trust in him." Spurgeon himself, so often quoted by Calvinists to support their view, was torn between his evangelist's heart that desired the salvation of all and his Calvinistic beliefs. At times he seemed to reject limited atonement, though he often firmly preached it. Sometimes he seemed to contradict himself almost within the same breath. For example, "I know there are some who think it necessary to their system of theology to limit the merit of the blood of Jesus. If my theological system needed such limitation, I would cast it to the winds. I dare not, allow the thought to find lodging in my mind. It seems so near akin to blasphemy. In Christ's finished work, I see an ocean of merit. My plummet finds no bottom, my eye discerns no shore. There must be sufficient efficacy in the blood of Christ, if God had so willed it to have saved not only all in this world, but all in 10,000 worlds. Having a divine person for an offering, it is not consistent to conceive of limited value. Bound and measure are terms inapplicable to the divine sacrifice. The intent of the divine purpose fixes the application of the infinite offering, but does not change it into a finite work. Merit and value must apply to the effect of the cross. If the cross is intended for a limited number, the elect, its merit and value are necessarily limited. If God had so willed it, is the key clause, which Spurgeon clearly denied at times. On the other hand, that Spurgeon believed salvation was available to all mankind is evident from many of his sermons. The contradiction is clear, a fact that Calvinists are reluctant to admit. Thus, I have been accused of misrepresenting and even misquoting C.H. Spurgeon. Sufficient further statements by Spurgeon, see the index, will be presented herein to enable readers to come to their own conclusions. Aggressive promotion. Calvinists are increasingly insisting that their peculiar dogmas represent the faith of the Reformers who led the Reformation, and should be accepted by all evangelical Christians as true Christianity, and as the biblical expression of the gospel. With respect to that, there is much they stand for with which all Christians would agree. There is much they stand for with which many evangelicals think they agree because of misunderstandings, but actually do not, which will be clarified in the following pages. There is much they stand for with regard to the Church, Israel, and the return of Christ, to which those who believe in the imminent rapture of the Church would take strong exception. These latter views have nothing to do with the gospel, and therefore will not be dealt with herein. In the year 2000, the Alliance of Reformation Christians met in London in opposition to the influence of the Toronto Blessing in England, and sent this message to evangelicals worldwide. We therefore call upon those who bear the label evangelical to affirm their faith once again in accordance with the witness of Scripture and in continuity with the historic testimony of the Church. By historic testimony of the Church, they mean the peculiar doctrines that come from Augustine, as interpreted and expanded by John Calvin, and which were at one time forced by a state church upon all in England and Scotland, and those parts of Europe where Calvinists were in control. Historic documentation is provided in chapters 5 and 6. Today's Calvinists speak even more earnestly and boldly about the need for a new Reformation, by which they very clearly mean a revival of Calvinism as the dominant view in Christendom. Consider some of the resolutions that make up the London Declaration 2000, Alliance of Reformation Christians, A Vision for Biblical Unity in the Modern Church, The Evangelical Problem. Under the question of truth, we therefore call upon evangelicals to return to the once-held biblical view that to lay claim to a particular doctrine, Calvinism, as true, is not spiritual arrogance, but a biblical duty. Under A Vision for Reformation, we therefore call upon evangelicals to affirm a vision for Reformation which is in accordance with the witness of Scripture and in continuity with the historic testimony of the Calvinist Church. Such a vision is of a church which is both Catholic and Reformed. By Catholic, we do not mean Roman Catholic. Listen to Chapter 4, Calvinism's Surprising Catholic Connection. By Reformed, we mean that we confess those doctrines about the authority of Scripture and salvation by grace alone, which our Reformed Calvinist forefathers reaffirmed at the time of the Reformation. Under 4 affirmations. Under 1, We likewise affirm that we are Augustinians in our doctrine of man and in our doctrine of salvation. This is because we believe that Augustine and his successors, including the Calvinist reformers, faithfully reflect the Bible's teaching regarding the total spiritual inability of fallen man to respond to God, God the Father's gracious unconditional election of a people to be saved, the design of the incarnate Son's atoning work as intended surely and certainly to secure the salvation of that people, the elect only, the monergistic grace of the Holy Spirit in regeneration, without understanding or faith on man's part, and the perseverance of the elect. Accordingly, we also reject all forms of synergism or semi-Pelagianism, in which man is accorded a cooperative role in his regeneration, even to believe. For example, Arminianism. We reject equally any softening of Augustinian soteriology, for example, Amyraldianism, four-point Calvinism, and any hardening of it, example, Hyper-Calvinism. The notion of one Catholic and Reformed Calvinist Church, one main majestic stream of historic Christian orthodoxy, Augustinianism, Calvinism, is thus integral to our understanding. This notion we affirm is true and foundational to any evangelical outlook worthy of its name. Under 2. Reformed Catholics affirm the importance of the Church and its history in any authentic vision of God's redemptive work in space and time. Evangelicalism today is infected with a deadly amnesia with regard to the historic Calvinist Church. We specifically reject the subjective and often disorderly spectacle of charismatic-style worship with its attendant practices, such as alleged tongue-speaking prophecies, slaying in the Spirit, etc. Under 4. We bemoan the influence among evangelicals of a pietistic dispensationalism in which the world is considered irredeemably wicked, and thus hardly worth the effort of influencing, and in which the only hope is supposed to be in the imminent rapture of the saints. A challenge to remain silent. With the recent upsurge of Calvinism, a number of leading Calvinists have begun to take a far more aggressive stance in its public promotion. Both sides, in fact, are increasingly making this issue a matter of fellowship in the Lord, resulting in division in a number of otherwise sound churches. In some churches, members are forbidden to promote Calvinism even privately. In others, only Calvinists are accepted as members. Of course, the latter has been true of pastors and mission candidates for centuries in nearly all Presbyterian churches, and even in some Baptist churches. But now that position seems to be growing. Almost daily, I found that this subject was claiming a wider interest and greater importance than I had ever imagined. It seemed obvious that there was great need for further research and writing to deal with this important issue. As it became known that I intended to write such a book, a number of pastors cautioned me to refrain from publicly expressing myself on this subject. Some claimed that, out of ignorance of its true teachings, I had already misrepresented Reformed doctrine. A typical response from the Calvinist friends to whom I had sent an early manuscript for comment went like this: "The caricatures you present and the straw men you construct demonstrate to me that you have absolutely no understanding of the Reformed position, and until you do, I would counsel that you refrain from putting anything in print." Letters began to pour into our ministry, the Berean Call, from around the world, many from pastors insisting that I was unqualified to address Calvinism, and urging me to seal my lips and drop my pen regarding this topic. It was suggested that I would lose many friends and alienate myself from leading evangelicals, most of whom were said to be convinced Calvinists. Furthermore, who would publish such a book, since the major publishers had brought out many books supporting the other side? What moved me most was the concern earnestly expressed by close friends that a book from me on this issue could cause division, the last thing I wanted. "We can hear it now," several friends told me. "Here comes Dave Hunt again. This time he's attacking Calvinists." That concern weighed heavily upon me. One must be willing to accept wise counsel, but the advice to remain silent, though given by so many out of genuine concern, seemed, after much prayer and soul-searching on my part, to be ill-advised. Spurgeon called the debate over God's sovereignty and man's free will a controversy which I believe to have been really healthy, and which has done us all a vast amount of good. My heart's desire is that this book will be only to God's eternal glory and to the blessing of his people.